They laughed when he raised his hand, laughed at the broken-down mule too sick to stand, and the man foolish enough to spend his last $2 on it. But what Thomas Yates uncovered wasn't just treasure. It was a buried legacy stretching back to the Civil War, a trail of secrets only that mule remembered. What started as pity turned into legend, and the dying animal no one wanted became the key to a story that would rewrite history, awaken a movement, and prove one truth. Sometimes the world's greatest miracles come wrapped in scars. The mule looked half dead, standing in a patch of dry weeds at the edge of the livestock pen. Its skin sagged over a gaunt frame, bones showing like scaffolding beneath sun-bleached fur. One of its ears drooped permanently to the side, and its eyes were dull, the kind of dull that said it had long stopped expecting kindness. A crooked scar ran down its haunch, a raised welt that looked like it might have come from barbed wire or a branding iron handled by a drunk. When the bidding started, no one even looked up. The auctioneer's voice cracked like a whip across the crowded fairground. Opening bid, $2 for the old gray mule, might be good for glue or ghosts. Laughter rolled through the crowd. Somebody hollered, "I'll pay not to take it," and others snorted through beer and chewing tobacco, already turning their attention to the younger stock penned nearby. Plump hogs, sleek calves, a pair of fine Appaloosa colts with bloodlines as proud as their price tags. But one man stayed. Thomas Yates, a stranger in these parts, held his ground at the edge of the auction line. He wore clothes that had seen too many washes, boots that leaned like tired men, and a wide-brimmed hat with sweat stains older than most of the fairground kids running around. He'd arrived that morning with a push cart, a bedroll, and exactly $6.37 in his pocket. By noon, he was down to 3,000 $3,000. And still he raised his hand. "I'll take him," he said, voice plain, eyes steady. The crowd blinked, unsure they'd heard right. The auctioneer leaned forward. "You bidding, sir?" Thomas nodded once. "Yes, sir. I'll give you $2 for the mule." Silence spread like spilled whiskey. "Sold," the auctioneer muttered, almost apologetically, "to the gentleman with a death wish." Laughter again. Someone called out, "Better dig a hole for that thing before you feed it. Save yourself the trouble." But Thomas didn't answer. He just stepped forward, took the thin rope tied to the mule's neck, and led it out of the pen. The animal followed, hooves dragging, head low. No fight, no spark, just a defeated kind of motion, like a shadow moving away from its own grave. People watched him go, some shaking their heads, others smirking like they were watching the start of a good joke. Thomas led the mule to the edge of town, to a dry patch of scrubland where he'd unrolled his blanket the night before, beneath the half-finished ribs of an abandoned cabin. The walls leaned like old men, the roof had collapsed years back, and a tangle of blackberry vines had claimed the outhouse. But it was land, and it was quiet. He tied the mule to a post that looked like it might still hold, gave it a drink from his own canteen, and sat down to think. The mule didn't move much. It stood there like it had nothing left to give. But its ears twitched sometimes, and once, when a bird flew too close, it gave a soft grunt, low and coarse, but alive. That was all Thomas needed. The next morning he was up before the sun. He'd found a cracked feed bucket behind the general store, bartered for a sack of oats with the last of his change, and hauled water in an old tin basin from the creek a mile east. He fed the mule by hand, slow and steady. The animal took the food without blinking, chewing like its jaw remembered better days. "Name's Clarence," Thomas said as he worked, running a brush down the mule's flanks. "Don't ask why, just feels right." Clarence didn't argue. By the third day, the mule had stopped leaning on the post. By the fifth, he walked without dragging his legs. By the seventh, he started pawing at the dirt with one hoof in the cool dawn air, just once, then again. That was the morning Thomas found the box. It started with Clarence's odd behavior. He kept pacing in tight circles behind the cabin, snorting like he smelled something strange. Thomas followed, confused, until the mule stopped and stomped twice, hard, on the packed earth. Thomas knelt. The ground looked like any other patch, dry, cracked, spotted with weeds. But something about the way Clarence stood over it, head down, ears perked forward like radar, told Thomas to dig. He used a broken-handled shovel he'd found leaning behind the church. The dirt gave way reluctantly, stubborn as secrets. 3 inches down, he hit something hard, a corner. Wood. He cleared the rest by hand, heart thudding, sweat dripping into his eyes. It was a box, small but sturdy, wrapped in oilcloth that crumbled like dried leaves at his touch. The iron latch had rusted shut, but the hinges gave way after a few firm kicks. Inside were papers, old deeds, yellowed maps, a faded leather-bound ledger with columns of numbers and names that stretched back decades, and at the very bottom, beneath a false panel, a pouch of gold coins, heavy, dull with age, stamped with the year 1862. Confederate Mint. Thomas sat back hard on the dirt, blinking. Clarence just stared down at him. It took hours to go through everything. The box had belonged to a man named Jeremiah Brooks, a Confederate paymaster who'd vanished during the war with an entire regiment's worth of payroll. Rumors said he'd hidden the money and the records, planning to come back for them. He never had. The land Thomas slept on, the ruin of the old cabin, had once been Brooks's hideout, and Clarence, the dying mule no one wanted, had found what no one else could. Within a week, Thomas had lawyers from 2 towns circling like vultures. The deeds were real, the claims still valid under old territory laws. The coins alone were worth a small fortune to collectors, but the real gold was in the land ownership. Turns out, the overgrown plot held rights to a dozen mineral-rich acres on the North Ridge. Land now occupied by a company quarry that had been pulling granite and lime for years without a clear owner. When the lawyers finished their counting and the courts cleared the title, Thomas Yates became a very wealthy man. He didn't move, didn't buy a mansion or a carriage or a tailored suit. He rebuilt the cabin, added a real roof, and planted blackberry vines on purpose. And Clarence? Clarence got a new saddle, the finest hay, and more carrots than he knew what to do with. People came by the dozens to see the mule that had sniffed out a fortune. They offered to buy him. One man from Chicago offered $10,000 for Clarence on the spot. Thomas laughed in his face. He ain't for sale. Clarence didn't just dig up gold, he dug up my life. The man blinked, confused. Thomas just smiled. They laughed when I bought him, he said. But you know what? Some things are worth more than coin. Clarence brayed, as if in agreement. Word of the mule's discovery spread like wildfire. By the time 2 weeks had passed, it seemed every newspaper within 500 miles had run the story of the miracle mule of Medford County. Reporters came with notebooks and cameras, snapping grainy photos of Clarence in his pen, trying to get him to repeat the moment he pawed at the earth and revealed a fortune. Some tried tossing carrots where they wanted him to dig. Others stood beside him whispering nonsense about buried treasure. Clarence ignored them all with regal indifference, chewing oats like a king watching fools dance. Thomas, on the other hand, didn't much care for the attention. He'd lived his life in shadows and silence, working where there was work, sleeping where the wind didn't bite too hard, and keeping his name out of trouble. But now the whole county knew his face. People came knocking with stories of kin who might have once owned the land, with forged paperwork or sob stories about sick children and broken roofs that only a small loan might fix. Thomas turned them all away, politely but firmly. Clarence, for his part, had taken to standing guard near the cabin porch, his once dull eyes now sharp and suspicious. But Thomas wasn't done with digging. The documents in the box had mentioned other properties, parcels of land bought up quietly under fake names during the war. And while some had surely been swallowed up by towns and farmland, Others lay in forgotten places, drawn only on maps that Jeremiah Brooks had scribbled by candlelight in fear of his secrets dying with him. So Thomas began a quiet search. Every few days he and Clarence would set off down old trails, following creek beds and ridge lines described in the faded ledger. Clarence wore a saddlebag with essentials, a pickaxe, a rolled-up map, a pair of old binoculars Thomas had traded for in town. The mule never complained, never slowed. In fact, he seemed to thrive the farther from town they went. One morning they came upon a dry gulch about 10 miles south of town. The area was nothing but rock and scrub brush, the kind of place buzzards circled and men avoided, but Clarence stopped dead just before the gully and stared. He sniffed the air and turned, walking directly toward a dead tree split down the middle by lightning. There, beneath the cracked earth, Thomas found a small iron strongbox. It wasn't as valuable as the first one, just a few gold coins and a journal with names and debts owed, but it proved something. Clarence could find what others had missed. Somehow, some way, the mule remembered. That discovery shifted everything. Thomas began to think back on what little the auctioneer had said about Clarence's previous owner, an old man named Withers who died alone on a rocky patch of land near the border. Nobody had known much about him except that he kept to himself and spent years riding that same mule all over the territory, poking around old mining camps and ghost towns. Folks had called him crazy. "Treasure Withers," they'd say with a laugh, "out hunting ghosts and gold with a mule who's got more brains than he does." They'd buried Withers in a pine wood box behind a crumbling church and auctioned the mule the next day. And now it seemed maybe Withers hadn't been crazy at all. Maybe he'd just been close, real close, to finding something bigger than anyone guessed. And maybe Clarence had remembered more than the roads they traveled. Thomas started calling the mule Professor when no one was around. The third find came 2 weeks later, at the base of a cliff that had once been the north wall of the abandoned Copperhead mine. Clarence had refused to cross the river, planting his hooves stubbornly in the mud until Thomas gave in and turned up a narrow trail along the canyon rim. Halfway up, Clarence stopped and stared at a rock outcropping shaped like a claw. Behind it, buried beneath a flat stone, was a satchel of silver coins wrapped in cloth so rotted it turned to powder in Thomas's hands. Every find, no matter how small, added to a growing fortune. But it also brought danger. The first warning came in the form of a letter, slipped under Thomas's cabin door in the middle of the night. The paper was thick, the handwriting elegant, and the message simple. "We know what you're finding. We'll make you an offer. Refuse, and you won't live to regret it." There was no signature, just a red wax seal with the impression of a crow. Thomas stared at it for a long time. Then he crumpled it up, fed it to the fire, and poured himself a cup of coffee. Clarence stood in the yard, ears twitching, as if he already knew something dark was moving through the hills. A week later, someone tried to poison the mule. Thomas found the carrots, too orange, too perfect, scattered just outside the pen. He cut one open with a pen knife and saw the strange grainy powder packed near the core. Strychnine. Not enough to kill a man maybe, but plenty to take down a mule. He burned the carrots in silence and sat beside Clarence for the rest of the night, rifle across his knees. Trouble, real trouble, arrived in the form of a man named Silas Cutter. He rode into town with 2 wagons, 6 hired guns, and a face like a worn-out axe. No one knew exactly where he came from, only that he had money, maps, and an appetite for mining claims. He bought up 3 old properties in one afternoon and offered Thomas a blank check for everything he'd found. "Whatever you think it's worth," Silas said, smiling with teeth too white for his sun-dried skin. "Double it, then sign here." Thomas declined. Silas didn't smile after that. The next night, his men came. They waited until Thomas was away, having a drink at the saloon, something he rarely did. He left Clarence tethered behind the cabin and walked into town for an hour, mostly to ask the blacksmith about a new horseshoe. When he came back, the fence was burning. The cabin door hung off its hinges, and Clarence was gone. Thomas didn't hesitate. He grabbed his rifle, filled his pockets with cartridges, and tracked the hoofprints into the woods. He found Clarence 2 miles north, in a clearing lit only by moonlight and fire. Silas's men had tied the mule to a post and were standing around with ropes and knives, arguing about whether they should just kill the animal or wait for their boss to arrive. They didn't see Thomas until the first shot rang out. 2 went down immediately. The others scattered, but Thomas didn't miss again. By the time the smoke cleared, 4 men lay groaning in the dirt, and the 5th had vanished into the night. Clarence stood perfectly still. Rope snapped in half, a streak of blood down his flank that wasn't his own. Thomas walked up and laid a hand on the mule's neck. "I should have known they'd come for you," he whispered. He led Clarence back home that night, rebuilt the cabin, added a second lock, and buried the bodies in a ravine with no names on the stones. But he knew it wasn't over. Silas Cutter wouldn't stop. Not for a mule, not for a man, not when he smelled gold in the wind. So Thomas made a plan. He hired a lawyer in Carson City, a clever man with an appetite for details and a fondness for justice. Together they filed deeds, patented claims, and registered every bit of property Clarence had led them to under a blind trust. Thomas became a ghost in the books, no visible link to the treasure, just a caretaker of records and rights. The law was slow, but it was strong if you knew how to wield it. Meanwhile, Clarence kept digging. They found an old Spanish silver bell buried in the roots of a tree marked with an X. They uncovered a safe from the 1880s, filled with Confederate bonds and handwritten letters from soldiers long gone. They found gold dust in the cracks of a dried-up stream bed, stashed in a tin flask that someone had tried to hide before meeting a bad end. Every find told a story. Every haul grew the legend. And Clarence, the dying mule no one wanted, became the most valuable animal west of the Mississippi. By the time winter came, Thomas had enough money to buy the entire county if he wanted. He didn't. Instead, he built a school with no tuition, a hospital with real doctors, and a barn the size of a church just for Clarence. When Silas Cutter made one last offer, $50,000 in cash and a guaranteed cut of future profits, Thomas sent back a single word written on the back of a silver coin: never. A week later, Cutter vanished. Some said he'd gone back east, others that he'd tried to cross the Rockies in a blizzard and failed. Thomas didn't ask. He didn't care. All that mattered was that he and Clarence were left alone. Years passed. The land healed, the vines bore fruit, the mines yielded less, but enough. Clarence grew old, his step slower, his gaze softer. But even in his last months, the mule would still pause sometimes, sniff the wind, and nudge Thomas toward something half buried in the ground. On the day Clarence died, Thomas sat beside him under a cedar tree. He didn't cry, he just whispered, "Thank you," and buried him beneath the roots of the same tree where they'd once found a rusted revolver wrapped in oilcloth. Thomas lived another 10 years, quietly, rich beyond measure, but still walking the same trails, wearing the same hat, drinking the same coffee from a dented tin mug. When he finally passed, they found his will carved into wood and nailed to the cabin wall. "Everything I own, everything I built, everything I know, it came from a mule nobody wanted. Remember that. And if you see value in something the world throws away, maybe you'll get lucky too." They buried him beside Clarence. And for years after, folks would come to that hillside to see the graves, to read the carvings, and to remember the story of the man who followed a dying mule into the past and came out with the future. They called it luck. They called it fate. They called it anything but what it really was: judgment. Thomas had known from the first time he looked into Clarence's tired eyes that the mule wasn't just another beat-down piece of livestock. There had been something deeper there, something watching, something choosing, and while the world laughed at a man who'd spent his last $2 on an animal so ragged it looked like it'd die before sunset, Clarence had known what Thomas was willing to risk. That mattered. Word of their story lived longer than either of them. Schools taught it as a lesson in seeing value where others see none. Economists dissected the decisions Thomas made, trying to extract formulas from instinct. Treasure hunters swarmed the county every spring, thinking they could find what Thomas and Clarence had missed, but they never did, because Clarence had never been about gold. Not really. That truth didn't become clear until many years after both of them had been laid to rest. It started with a letter. It arrived in the town clerk's office, sealed in an envelope yellow with age and addressed in a script long out of style. No return address, no stamp. Just the words, "To be opened 20 years after my death." The clerk, a young man named Russell, who'd only taken the job 6 months earlier, almost tossed it in the junk pile. But curiosity tugged harder. He steamed it open carefully and unfolded the pages inside. It was from Thomas, and it changed everything. The letter was a map, not a normal one, more a story than a set of directions. But in Thomas's looping script were references, landmarks, descriptions that someone with the right eyes could trace. There were mentions of old creek beds that had shifted with time, of boulders that only cast a certain shadow in mid-autumn, of a barn that no longer stood but once had a weather vane shaped like a crow. At the end of the letter, Thomas had written one final line. "Clarence showed me where the silver slept, but there was something else he always looked toward, something deeper. I didn't follow him that last time. Maybe you will." That was enough for Russell. He took the next 2 months off, pored over old surveyor maps, walked the land, talked to locals who remembered where the blackberries grew thickest and the storms rolled in fastest. He traced every turn Thomas described, and every time he lost the trail, he asked himself one question: where would Clarence go next? The answer came one cold October morning. It was just past dawn when Russell found the entrance. It wasn't marked, wasn't even open, not at first. But he saw the way the cliff curved unnaturally at the base of a ridge, forming a half-moon pocket in the stone. Birds avoided it. Wind passed around it. And when he cleared the fallen brush with a rusted shovel, he saw the faint shape of a rectangle carved into the earth, just like the trapdoor Thomas had once described finding years ago. This one had no handle, just a carved message in the wood. For the one who listened. Russell paused, heart pounding, then started digging. The hatch creaked open on hinges that whined like old ghosts. A ladder descended into darkness, and the air that rose to meet him smelled of history. And something else, something alive. He descended slowly, flashlight gripped tight, the wood groaning beneath each step. The tunnel was narrower than he expected, but dry, carefully braced. The kind of construction that came not from engineers, but from people who knew what it meant to hide something well. At the bottom, Russell found a room, a chamber really. Stone walls carved smooth, shelves lined with crates, barrels, books somehow untouched by decay, and in the center, covered by an oilcloth and resting on a wide stone table, lay something impossible, a journal. It wasn't Thomas's handwriting, nor Wither's. This hand was sharper, older. It belonged to Jeremiah Brooks. Russell opened it slowly. The journal told a different story, not of treasure, but of protection, of a cache of knowledge buried during the war, records not just of gold, but of movements, safe houses, escape routes for enslaved people and rebels alike, maps of the underground rail lines, names of Union sympathizers who'd risked their lives helping strangers reach freedom, code keys, cipher wheels. Thomas hadn't found a mine. He'd found a vault. And Clarence? Clarence had known. Somehow, some way, the mule had remembered every place Withers had taken him, every route, every pause beside a rock or a tree or a river where something important had been hidden. It hadn't been about money. It had been about memory. A mule who'd been witness to a hidden network built on hope. A mule who had carried more secrets than most men ever knew. Russell sat in the chamber for hours, reading, weeping, realizing that what Thomas had protected all those years wasn't just silver. It was truth. He cataloged every item, took careful notes, and brought in historians under the strictest confidentiality. What they found would eventually rewrite entire chapters of Civil War history. The town built a museum in Thomas's honor, though he'd never have wanted it. They named it after Clarence, the Mule's Memory Museum. Visitors came from around the world to see the artifacts, to read the journal, to stare at the crude wooden sign over the doorway that said, "See what others missed." And beside it, they mounted the last photo ever taken of Thomas Yates and Clarence, man and mule, standing shoulder to shoulder beneath a golden sky, faces turned not to the camera, but toward the hills. All was looking forward. All was listening. Years passed, and the museum stood as a quiet monument, not just to history, but to something far rarer, humility. In a world obsessed with spectacle, the story of Thomas Yates and Clarence endured not because of the treasure they found, but because of the way they'd found it, patiently, quietly, with eyes that saw past surface and ears that listened not to noise, but to silence. Every year, on the day Clarence had been bought at auction, a small crowd gathered in the museum courtyard. No speeches, no pageantry, just a few folks, many of them strangers to each other, each laying a single coin at the base of the bronze statue that had been erected in Clarence's image. The statue was small, unassuming, not some heroic pose, not the rearing figure you might expect. Just a mule, head low, one ear cocked sideways, as if listening to something only he could hear. The plaque beneath it didn't list accomplishments or awards. It held one quote: "He didn't dig for riches, he dug for what mattered." The town around the museum changed. Roads paved over old trails, new families built homes where the blackberry vines once ran wild, and phone towers grew where the pines used to touch the clouds. But that hillside where Thomas and Clarence had first made their home stayed just the same. No one developed it. No one dared. It was sacred ground now. And though decades rolled forward, the mule's legend didn't fade. Stories spread far beyond the county line. Writers published novels loosely based on the tale. Kids in far-off cities read picture books about the miracle mule and his quiet partner. The story appeared in documentaries, podcasts, even whispered in military academies as a lesson in unconventional intelligence. And through it all there remained something no one could quite explain. Other mules, not just any, rescued ones, sick, scarred, unwanted. But over the years, more than a dozen were adopted by people inspired by Clarence's story. And in time, a strange pattern emerged. One helped uncover a family heirloom lost in a collapsed barn. Another led its owner to a sunken depression in a field that turned out to be the foundation of a 200-year-old homestead. Still another refused to cross a pasture during a storm, minutes before lightning struck the very tree it would have passed under. Coincidence, they called it. But those who remembered Clarence weren't so sure. They started calling it the Yates spark, a kind of inherited instinct passed down through the broken, rejected animals that nobody wanted. A gift not of strength or speed, but of something deeper, the ability to sense value hidden beneath the dust and ruin of the world. Clarence, it seemed, had lit a torch in the dark, and the flame hadn't gone out. One particularly cold winter, a girl named Mabel, just 12 years old, stood at Clarence's statue with her father. Her cheeks were red with wind, her coat a size too big, and her hands clutched a drawing she'd made of Clarence, complete with a golden box at his feet and a bright star in the sky above him. Her father was a quiet man, a single parent, and he'd brought her to the museum as a kind of birthday wish. "He's just a mule," he said gently, not wanting to ruin her dreams. "You know that, right?" Mabel didn't answer at first. She looked up at the statue, then down at the picture, and said, "He found things that people stopped looking for." Her father didn't have a response to that. Not right away. But later that year, they adopted a mule from a rescue 3 counties over. Name was Dirt Clod, mostly bones and bad attitude, but by spring he'd turned docile. And that summer, he refused to walk the trail behind their orchard, where Mabel later found a broken wooden crate filled with glass medicine bottles and a doctor's ledger from the 1870s. Turned out, it matched records from a traveling clinic that had vanished during a storm a century earlier. They donated the find to the museum, and when asked what inspired them, Mabel just smiled and pointed at the bronze mule in the courtyard. "Clarence showed him how," she said. No one laughed, not anymore. The name Clarence became more than a name. It became a symbol, a shorthand for the things we discard, for the moments we overlook, for the decisions that seem foolish until they're not. And every time someone took a chance on the broken, the worn out, the left behind, they whispered his name like a prayer. One day, years after Thomas's last breath, and long after the coins from that first box had been spent, a man arrived in town carrying an old satchel and a pair of boots with dust from another continent on them. He didn't speak much. He walked straight to the museum, laid a worn leather journal on the front desk, and said, "This belongs with him." The clerk opened it. Inside were drawings, sketches of Clarence, landscapes with X's, side notes in pencil from someone who'd clearly spent years chasing the mule's trail. The handwriting was shaky, but the words were clear. He didn't stop at treasure. He carried memory, and memory doesn't die. The man didn't wait for thanks. He left the same way he came, quiet, steady, like a footnote to a larger story. That journal became the museum's newest exhibit. People stood in front of it for hours, reading every word. And outside, the wind moved through the trees above Clarence's statue. Leaves stirred, shadows danced. Some swore they saw the statue move just a little, ear twitching, nose lifted, as if Clarence was still listening, still watching, still waiting for the next fool-hearted soul to risk everything on a dying mule and stumble straight into something bigger than fortune, something true, something worth following. And one day, someone did. Her name was Nora Kincaid, and she had no idea that the old mule she rescued from a butcher's lot in Dakota was going to lead her to anything except a barn that didn't leak and a pasture where the poor beast could live out its days. She'd bought him for $1 and a bucket of old tools, mostly to spite the man trying to haul the creature off behind his pickup. The mule was skin and ribs, in Dumba, eyes goopy with infection, and one hoof so overgrown it curled like a twisted claw. Everyone told her it was a waste of time and money. She named him Croaker, mostly because of the sound he made when he brayed. Nora lived alone on a tiny patch of land that had once belonged to her great-uncle Silas. Yes, that Silas Cutter, the same man who had tried and failed to take Clarence's claim by force. The irony didn't escape her. The Cutter name had once been spat on in that part of the country, but she'd worked hard to make peace with the past. She hadn't known much about her family history until her father died and left her the deed to the land and a box of old letters. Those letters mentioned Thomas Yates once, and something about a damn mule that outwitted a dozen armed men. It made her smile, but she never thought much about it until Croaker started digging. It was early spring when it happened. She was out feeding the chickens, the wind whipping the scent of pine and frost through the air, when she heard it, that familiar, dry scraping of hoof against soil. Croker had taken to hanging around the back of the property, where the woods pressed close and the ground turned rocky. She figured he liked the shade. But when she found him that morning, he'd dug a hole 2 feet wide and nearly a foot deep, just like Clarence had. And when she peered in, she saw metal. Not silver, not gold, not even iron. It was brass. A bullet casing, still shiny after all those years, and beside it a tiny tin locket sealed tight with rust. Inside the locket was a curl of dark hair and a note folded so tight it took her an hour to open it without tearing it to pieces. The paper was brittle, the ink faded, but she made out the words. "If this reaches my Emily, know that I never stopped trying. I followed the trail through blood and storms. I buried the truth because they hunted it, but the mule remembered. The mule always remembered." Signed, W. Withers. Nora sat in the grass for a long time after that, wind tugging at her hair, Croker standing still beside her like a statue of bone and patience. The story had circled back. She followed Croker after that. Not every day. She had chores, animals, a job in town, but on the days when the air felt strange, or when Croker stood by the fence and refused to eat, she'd sling a backpack over one shoulder and say, "All right then, lead the way." And lead he did, to creek beds choked with ivy where arrowheads still lay buried, to a collapsed chimney stack in the woods that contained a false stone hiding 2 pocket watches and a letter written in code, to a hollow tree with a canister of Union Army scrip dated a week after the Battle of Honey Springs. Each discovery was small, singular, but together they told a story, a long one, rich with secrets and sadness and hope. Croker was Clarence's echo, not just in habit but in purpose. Nora couldn't explain how she knew, only that sometimes she'd see Croker staring off toward the north ridge, ears alert, body tense, like he remembered something even if he couldn't say what, and she started dreaming. Strange dreams of candlelight maps and firelit caves, of men whispering in codes, and of mules, always mules, walking the land with eyes like old books. She wrote it all down. Every trip, every artifact, every dream. She even kept a journal like Thomas had, though she didn't think anyone would ever care to read it. Until one day, someone did. It was a boy named Eli, who lived in the next town over. He was quiet, lanky, bookish, with a stutter that made most kids laugh and a father who made things worse. He found Nora one morning crouched by an old creek bed, brushing mud from a buried compass, and asked what she was doing. She told him the truth. He didn't laugh. He came back the next day with a notebook of his own. Soon there were 2 of them, then 3. By summer, 6 kids were combing the woods with her, listening to stories of Clarence and Thomas, scribbling notes, measuring roots, comparing rocks. Nora called them the Mule Trackers. They didn't care about treasure, they wanted the truth. And Croker led them, always. The mule lived another 5 years, long enough to see a new generation fall in love with the land, long enough to walk the same trails Clarence had once walked, long enough to lead Nora to one final discovery. It was behind a waterfall that only flowed in spring. Croker took her there on a Wednesday morning, with fog still thick on the valley floor. He brayed once, stepped through the mossy curtain, and stood beside a crack in the stone. She followed, heart pounding. Inside was a narrow cave, and in that cave were bones, not human. Mule. Clarence. Someone had brought him back, brought him here to rest, in the land he'd walked, beneath the rocks he'd once pointed to with such certainty. And beside him, sealed in waxed canvas, was a final journal. Thomas's, the real one, the one he hadn't shared. It held the rest of the story, the secrets he'd kept even from the lawyers, maps so detailed they gave latitude and longitude, stories of people Clarence had helped, slaves, outlaws, widows, a network of hidden places where hope had been buried, not to be forgotten but to be protected. And one last letter. If you're reading this, then you followed the right mule. The world will forget what matters unless someone reminds them. That's what he did. That's what you must do. Nora cried like she hadn't cried in years, not because of the treasure, not because of the history, but because she finally understood. Clarence hadn't just remembered. He'd passed the memory on, to Croker, to her, to anyone who cared enough to listen. The museum added a new wing that year, dedicated to the mule trackers, to Croker, and to the legacy of value found in the unwanted. They built a new statue, this one of two mules, one old, regal, and still the other younger, wilder mid-step, facing the horizon together. Beneath it were etched these words: "He didn't just find gold, he passed it on." And somewhere in the hills behind that quiet town, the wind still moves through the trees, the shadows still shift across forgotten paths, and the sound of hooves echoes faintly in the earth. Clarence was gone. But the trail? The trail never ends. And maybe that's the point. Maybe Clarence wasn't meant to be the ending of a story, but its beginning. Because while the world gets louder and the pace of life spins faster with each passing year, the ground remains the same. Beneath our cities, our farms, our forgetfulness, there is always something waiting. A history buried, a truth misplaced, a purpose ignored. It just takes someone with enough patience, enough stubbornness, enough heart to listen. That's why the mule trackers kept walking. Long after Nora passed on and Croker's hoofprints faded into grass, new generations carried the torch. They came from cities now, some wearing sneakers instead of boots, carrying iPads and GPS instead of maps and canteens. But they all started the same way, with a story, with Clarence. They gathered every spring beneath the cedars where Thomas and Clarence were buried. They brought food, told stories, and then broke off into groups with nothing more than curiosity and a compass. Some called it a hobby, others a tradition. But the ones who really listened knew better, because the finds kept coming. An old wedding ring wedged inside the hollow of a stone fence post. A carved wooden box beneath the church's broken floorboards. A flag, impossibly preserved, buried beneath two flat rocks arranged in the shape of a T. Nothing earth-shattering, nothing headline-worthy, but all of it real. Each discovery added another thread to the vast, intricate tapestry Clarence had started. And each time someone found something, they didn't keep it for themselves. They brought it back, donated it, shared it. Not because of some rule, but because it felt right. Because if a mule could give everything for people who'd laughed at him, then the least they could do was honor the lesson. The museum eventually outgrew its original structure. Donations poured in from across the globe, historians, schools, even a few governments that recognized the cultural weight of what had been uncovered. But the curators were careful. They didn't turn it into a circus or a profit engine. They kept it quiet. They kept it honest. They built a library wing made entirely from reclaimed barnwood, and every visitor was invited to write in the open journal kept at the center of the room. Some entries were just names and dates. Others were poems, drawings, questions. A few were confessions. The most common sentence, "I never believed until I saw it." In the main rotunda, where the sun hit just right through the tall windows in the afternoon, hung a painting. It was done in thick oils and deep shadows, but the center shone with warmth. Clarence stood in the foreground, hooves in soft dust, and Thomas beside him, head bowed, hand resting on the mule's shoulder. Behind them stretched the land, golden, endless. And in the sky, not clouds but shapes, echoes of mules that had come after. Croker, Dusty, Miss Alma, Red, all painted faint, like spirits watching the path unfold beneath them. Beneath the painting, carved into the marble, were Clarence's final recorded words, spoken not aloud, of course, but understood in the quiet space between a dying mule and the man he trusted. "You saw me when no one else did. Now see what I've seen." And so they did. Hundreds of them. Thousands. One boy, just 13, uncovered a broken compass in a canyon no one had mapped before. He carried it home and slept with it under his pillow. His father laughed, said it was junk, but the boy didn't throw it away. Instead, he grew up to become a cartographer, mapped the last uncharted parts of the Canadian interior. He never forgot that mule-shaped statue in the museum courtyard. A girl from New York visited once on a school trip. She didn't say much, stayed behind while the rest of her classmates took selfies and looked bored. She sat by Clarence's grave and just stared at the soil. Years later, she became a veterinarian, opened a sanctuary for rescue animals, named the first mule she saved Thomas. And across the years, people continued to whisper, not just about the treasure or the mine or the gold that had bought back a man's life, but about the real treasure, the proof that sometimes the world gives second chances, not in thunder or lightning, but in the shape of something plain, humble, and overlooked. A mule, a man, a story, passed from hoof to boot, from dirt to hand, from silence into memory. And though Clarence's bones rested beneath a cedar tree on a quiet hill, though Thomas's cabin had long returned to the earth, the trail they carved still pulsed beneath the feet of anyone who dared look down and listen. So next time you see something, or someone, that the world has already written off, stop. Think. Ask yourself what Clarence would have done, then follow your gut. Because the greatest paths don't come with signs, they come with hoof prints. And if you're lucky enough to spot one, don't ask where it leads, just follow. And somewhere, maybe not far from where you are right now, there's a dusty trail that's gone unnoticed for decades. It cuts between two hills so low they don't show up on most maps. The wind moves through it like it remembers. The trees along the edge lean just slightly westward, as if bowing to some silent procession long since past. If you stand still there long enough, quiet as the old days, still as the bones of memory, you might feel it, not see it, not hear it, feel it. The weight of stories under the soil, the echo of iron shoes on stone, the breath of something old and patient moving beside you, just out of sight. They say Clarence never made a sound in his final hour. No cry, no wheeze, no protest. He simply lay down beneath the cedar and closed his eyes, as if he'd finally reached the end of a map drawn only in his mind. And Thomas, white-haired, stooped but proud, sat beside him for hours with a hand resting on the mule's shoulder, whispering things no one else ever heard. When they buried Clarence, Thomas did it with his own two hands. No service, no crowd, just a stone, flat and wide, with a single word carved in it. Partner. That was enough. Years later, when it came time to bury Thomas, they laid him beside that same stone. People offered bigger headstones, even statues. The mayor of 3 counties attended. But in the end, all they put above his grave was another stone, this one with the word grateful. Clarence and Thomas, side by side, a partner grateful. And that was the story. That was the lesson. Not the silver, not the deeds, not the treasure that sparked 100 searches and filled 100 pockets. It was the mule, the dying mule no one wanted, who changed everything, because he saw something no one else did, and more importantly, because someone finally saw him. So now the story lives in the dirt and the wind and the breath between heartbeats. It lives in the choices we make when no one's watching. It lives in the broken things we choose to believe in. And if one day you find yourself at a crossroads, staring at something or someone that looks useless, worn down, past its time, remember this. They laughed when he bought the dying mule, but the mule remembered, and the trail still waits. And if you listen closely, in the quietest parts of the world, far from highways, far from headlines, far from the noise that tells us what matters and what doesn't, you might still hear the distant clop of hooves on dry earth. Because Clarence was never just one mule. He was every mule, every soul passed over, every voice ignored, every quiet heart that carried greatness wrapped in scars. That's why even now, when the sun hangs low and the hills are bathed in gold, old-timers in Medford County say the same thing to their grandkids as they pass the old Yates cabin or pause beneath the statue outside the museum. Watch the ones nobody watches. They see what we can't. And the kids nod, sometimes confused, sometimes giggling, but some of them, just a few, grow up to understand exactly what it means. They become mule trackers. They walk where no trails are marked. They dig where no shovels have touched. And once in a while, when the wind is right and the light cuts just so across the field, they find something. Not always silver, not always gold. Sometimes it's just a name carved into bark, or a ribbon tied around a forgotten fence post, or a photograph hidden in the wall of an old church that never made the news. But every time it means something, because Clarence had started something bigger than wealth. He'd started a movement of the mind, of the heart, a way of living that said, you don't have to be strong, you don't have to be fast, you just have to remember where to look. They say the world's full of noise now. They say people don't pay attention anymore. But Clarence's story? It still finds its way through, passed down in bedtime stories and campfire tales, in dusty books and whispered legends, in museums that smell like old cedar, and in hoofprints pressed into soil that's been turned 1,000 times. Because somewhere out there, another Clarence waits, another dying mule, another discarded creature with a heart like a compass and memories longer than the road, waiting for someone foolish enough, brave enough, kind enough to see what's really there and follow, because that's the thing no one ever really understands, not until they've walked the miles, not until they've listened to the wind and trusted something the rest of the world called worthless. Clarence didn't just remember where the treasure was. He remembered why it was buried and who it was buried for. The first time Thomas stood over that silver-veined tunnel, he thought he'd found salvation, a lifeline, a way to keep from starving. But Clarence had led him to more than that. The deeper Thomas dug, literally and figuratively, the more he saw that Clarence's path had been carved not by greed but by purpose. The coins, the deeds, the journals, they were pieces of a larger puzzle, a web of hidden truths scattered across time, waiting for someone willing to move slow enough, humble enough, and careful enough to pick them up and put them back together. And it was never about digging in the right place, it was about following the right voice. Because Clarence never pushed, he never pulled. He simply paused and looked, and waited for someone who would trust him. Years after Thomas's death, a researcher named Glenna Hart discovered that almost every major find Clarence led to matched up with migration records of freed slaves, orphaned children, and displaced families from the Civil War era. That map, long dismissed as folklore, became a foundational piece of a historical movement that would trace forgotten lives and reunite fractured bloodlines. All because a mule, with bad joints and sad eyes, had once stamped his hoof in a patch of dirt. But here's the part no one could ever fully explain. Every mule that followed Clarence's trail had the same look in their eyes. They came from different places, different breeds, different ages. But every single one of them had that same quiet wisdom, that same steadiness, that same patience that couldn't be trained. It couldn't be taught. It had to be earned. It had to be carried. So people began to believe something impossible, that Clarence had passed it on, not just to other animals, but to people. That the spark of recognition wasn't a fluke, but a legacy, a thread through time connecting those who saw value where others saw waste, those who followed instinct over orders, those who gave their last dollar for something that looked like it was already gone. They started calling it Clarence's Law, The more useless it looks, the more important it probably is. And soon that phrase wasn't just spoken on farms or carved into benches beneath whispering trees. It appeared in classrooms, in business meetings, on protest signs, a reminder that the things we throw away often carry the deepest meaning. It became a way of seeing the world, and wherever someone looked down and saw a broken thing and still bent to lift it, Clarence's story lived again. Sometimes that was a kid fixing an old radio instead of buying a new one. Sometimes it was a woman walking past a locked facility and deciding to volunteer there instead of looking away. Sometimes it was a man standing in front of an auction pen, watching as the crowd laughed, his fingers tightening around the last $2 he had. Every story since Clarence was just another verse of the same old song, a ballad of belief, of vision, of listening to what others ignore. So if you're reading this and the world tells you something's worthless, be it an object, an animal, a person, even yourself, think of that mule. Think of the hooves on the hillside. Think of the box in the earth. Think of the eyes that remembered, and follow, because the trail never ends, and some of the greatest things this world has ever known started with someone who was laughed at, and a mule nobody wanted. So what does it all mean in the end? It means that stories, real stories, aren't always loud. They don't always ride in on thunder or blaze across headlines. Sometimes they begin with a whisper, a moment, a look exchanged between a man and an animal too tired to stand up straight, a rusted gate swinging open on a forgotten auction yard, a decision so small no one notices, until it changes everything. Clarence didn't set out to be a legend. He just walked. Walked when no one believed in him. Walked when his ribs showed through his skin and his breath rattled in the cold. Walked through valleys of doubt and hills of silence, trusting that if he kept going, someone would follow. And someone did. And now every time a boot crunches down on gravel, where the maps run out, every time a hand brushes dirt away from something long buried, every time a heart says, "I don't know why, but I believe this matters," Clarence lives again. That's the real legacy. Not the silver, not the journals, not the deeds, but the fire passed hand to hand, hoof to heart. There's a boy right now in Colorado digging behind his grandfather's barn because he heard a story that won't leave him alone. There's a woman in Georgia who just rescued a mule from a flooded pasture, even though her neighbors called her foolish. There's a teacher in Ohio telling her students, "Don't ever laugh at the kid with holes in his shoes. He might be Clarence." There's you, holding the story in your hands, wondering if maybe, just maybe, it was meant for you. So here it is, your invitation. Next time you see a trail with no markers, take it. Next time you find something rusted, don't toss it. Next time you feel drawn to the thing everyone else ignores, listen. You might hear hoofbeats in the silence. You might find a buried box. You might be laughed at. But you also might change everything, just like he did. The mule who walked into history with nothing but scars and memory. The man who gave his last coins for a second chance. The story that proved forever that value isn't what others say it is. It's what you see and what you're willing to follow. So saddle up. Clarence is still walking, and the trail never ends. Somewhere out there, maybe miles from town, maybe just around the bend of your own life, there's a patch of ground that hasn't been disturbed in generations. No markers, no signs, just a stretch of earth like any other. Dry grass, old stones, a few trees standing like sentinels from another time. You might pass it 100 times and never think twice. But then one day the light might shift just right, and you'll notice it. The ground isn't just ground, it's waiting for someone who remembers how to see, someone like Thomas, someone like you. Because every buried truth needs a finder, every hidden history needs a hand to brush back the dust, and every quiet miracle begins with a step taken not in certainty, but in faith. Clarence's legacy was never meant to be confined to a single man, a single mine, or a single miracle. It was meant to be passed along, like a lantern in the dark, carried by those brave or foolish enough to follow instincts that don't always make sense. The ones who walk with the mule, not ahead of it, not behind it, with it. They're still out there, those people, scattered like starlight across a wide country, quietly changing the world one gentle decision at a time. A rescue here, a risk there. A moment where they choose to believe in something that can't speak, can't promise, can't guarantee a thing, only wait. And the mules, they're still waiting too, in dusty lots, in crooked barns, in overgrown pastures, in the backs of livestock trailers headed nowhere good. They're waiting for someone to say, "I see you, you matter, come with me." And when it happens, when one of those old souls gets pulled back from the edge, they remember, just like Clarence. They remember where the bones are buried. They remember what was lost. They remember the way. Not because they were trained to, because they were meant to. That's the secret no one tells you at the start of these kinds of stories. The buried treasure, the gold, the history, it's never the point. The mule is the treasure, the lesson. The proof that sometimes the greatest gift you can receive is the chance to love something the world forgot. And to be loved back, trusted back, with the kind of loyalty that could shake heaven if it ever stomped its hoof loud enough. So when the world calls you foolish, when they laugh as you bet your last dollar on something broken, smile, tip your hat, hold tight to the lead rope, and walk on. Because Clarence was never just walking through the hills, he was drawing a map, one that doesn't fade, one that leads straight to the heart of what matters. And if you're following it, you're already rich. And if you follow that map long enough with open eyes and a quiet heart, you may come to understand the real ending to Clarence's story, that there isn't one. Because stories like his don't end. They echo. They settle into the bones of the earth and the souls of those who still believe in something deeper than what's easy, something stronger than what shines. Maybe someday you'll be standing at the edge of your own auction yard, metaphorical or not, holding everything you've got in a trembling hand, staring at something nobody else wants, something bent, something dirty, something dismissed. And maybe you'll feel it, that little tug inside your chest, the one Thomas felt, the one every true mule tracker learns to trust. You won't know why. There won't be any proof, no promise of gold, no glittering guarantee, just that feeling, that maybe, just maybe, what you're looking at isn't junk. It's a key to something lost, to something waiting, to something that remembers. And if you're brave enough to say yes, to walk past the laughter, to hand over your last coin and lead that forgotten soul home, then you'll know what Thomas knew, what Nora knew, what every step of Clarence's long and tireless trail was trying to tell us all. That what we choose to believe in defines what we find. That what we give our hearts to becomes the legacy we leave behind. And that sometimes the world's greatest truths don't arrive in chariots or come wrapped in velvet. Sometimes they walk on crooked legs, with a torn ear and eyes full of memory. So look closely, listen carefully, and when the moment comes, when the wind shifts and the dust clears, and the path forks toward the unknown, follow the mule, always follow the mule, because somewhere up ahead there's a box waiting beneath the soil, and inside is the next chapter of a story that only you can write. So take that step, not because it's safe, not because it makes sense, but because something inside you knows, like Clarence knew, that the greatest things in life don't always look like much at first. They show up weathered, quiet, tired, but they carry stories, they carry truth, they carry you, and when you find yourself walking that uncertain path, boots scuffing against stone, wind tugging at your sleeves, remember this: Clarence didn't lead Thomas to silver. He led him to purpose, to legacy, to a life that meant something. That's what's waiting out there, in old barns, in forgotten trails, in the broken, bruised pieces of the world that no one wants to fix. There's magic in the overlooked, there's power in the humble, and there's destiny in every quiet decision to love what others leave behind. Clarence knew. He always knew. And now you do too. So walk on. The trail's still warm. And the next mule, he's waiting. Head low, hooves still, eyes watching you like he's seen it all before. Because maybe he has. Maybe he's seen 100 Thomas Yateses come and go. Maybe he's seen 1,000 Clarences rise up from dust and carry history on their backs. And maybe, just maybe, he's been waiting for you to take the rope, to ignore the laughter, to believe in what no one else sees. So go ahead, say yes. And follow the dying mule, because the moment you do, you'll never be the same again. And somewhere far down that trail, long after the road has disappeared behind you and the voices of doubt have gone quiet, you'll realize something else, something simple, something sacred. It was never about finding the treasure. It was about becoming the kind of person who could. Because Clarence didn't just guide Thomas to a box of silver, he guided him back to himself, to strength he didn't know he had, to belief that had dried up like the cracked earth beneath his feet, to the truth that what's broken can still lead, what's tired can still teach, and what's unwanted can still save everything. So yes, the trail is long. Yes, the wind can be cold. Yes, you might stumble, and you will doubt. But the mule walks ahead, steady and unhurried, hooves kissing the earth like it remembers every sorrow, every secret, every triumph buried in the dust. And he waits for you, because the story doesn't end at the grave, or the gold, or the glory. It continues in every hand that reaches down to lift what others have dropped. In every choice to trust the quiet over the loud. In every whisper that says, "There's more here, keep going." So go, find your trail. Walk it with faith, not certainty. And know this, the mule never leads where you expect, only where you're meant to go. And if you let him, if you trust him, he'll take you to something far more valuable than silver. He'll take you to who you were always meant to be. And that changes everything. So by the time you come to the end of your trail, when your boots are worn thin and your hands carry the dust of 1,000 forgotten places, you'll look back and realize it wasn't just the mule who changed your life. You changed his too. Because all Clarence ever needed was one person to believe, one person to look past the bones, the scars, the silence, and see worth. And in that moment, when Thomas raised his hand and said, "I'll take him," Clarence didn't just find a home. He found hope, and that hope lived on. Through Croker, through Nora, through every mule tracker that followed the sound of memory echoing down forgotten paths, through every soul brave enough to give something broken a second chance. Maybe that's what this story has always been, a second chance for Clarence, for Thomas, for the land, the truth, the buried things no one thought mattered anymore. And maybe now, for you. Because if you've made it this far, if you've walked alongside this story step for step, then maybe some part of you has heard it too, that quiet call beneath the noise of the world, that pull toward the path no one else sees, that feeling that something old and wise is watching, waiting, and willing to walk beside you if only you'll let it. So here's the last thing you need to know. You're not too late. The trail is still here. The wind still carries the scent of cedar and silver. The ground still holds its secrets. And somewhere, just over the next rise, a mule you haven't met yet is standing still as stone, ears twitching, eyes watching the horizon, waiting for someone, just one person, to believe again. So take that step. Not for gold, not for glory, for the story, for the memory, for the mule. Because Clarence never truly died. He just passed the trail to you. And when you finally take that step, when your foot touches the path carved by hooves that came long before, you'll feel it, like a current running beneath your skin. Not fear, not doubt, recognition, like something ancient has opened its eyes again, breathed you in and whispered, "There you are." The mule doesn't hurry. He never did. He moves at the pace of truth, steady, patient, unshaken by the rush of men or the ticking of clocks. And you, who once stood unsure at the edge of it all, now move in rhythm with him. One step, then another, listening not to the world, but to the space between. And what you find won't always glitter. It won't always make sense. But it will matter. It will be real. An old ring buried in the roots of a tree whose bark once marked a place of promise. A photo, curled and stained, hidden behind a brick in a chimney no one's used in 100 years, faces you've never seen but somehow know. A journal page tucked inside a barn wall, describing how one mule wouldn't leave a clearing where you now stand. The more you walk, the more you'll see that Clarence didn't just lead Thomas to silver. He led him to the past, to the truth that time doesn't bury everything. Some things choose to wait, to be found by those willing to listen to silence, to follow instinct, to love what others mock. And so the trail goes on, not in a straight line, not to some final destination, but through lives, through generations, through you. Because the real treasure was never in the ground. It was always in the choice, to believe in the broken, to follow the forgotten, to walk with the mule. And now the trail is yours, and with the trail now yours, something shifts. Not in the world, not yet, but in you. Because once you've walked beside the mule, once you've listened to the rhythm of steps that don't rush, don't fear, don't chase, you change. Your eyes don't look at the world the same way. You start noticing the bent nail holding up the sagging fence post, the cracked window in the church no one enters anymore, the man on the corner with nothing in his hands but time. And instead of walking past, you stop, because you remember. Clarence had been all of those things once, and someone stopped for him. The stories you used to think were about silver and adventure now read differently. Now they're stories about faith, about vision, about the quiet courage to walk into the unknown with nothing but trust in something no one else sees. And that's what makes you a mule tracker, not the discoveries, not the maps, not the medals or exhibits or legends told around campfires, but the way you carry the story. Not like a trophy, like a lantern. You pass it on to the child whose hands tremble as they try to mend something broken, to the neighbor who thinks no one sees the hours they spend keeping a failing garden alive, to the animal no one would bet a dime on, but who watches you with the same eyes Clarence once had. And then, one day, it happens. You see someone else do it. Someone else stops, someone else bends down, someone else takes a step off the road and into the brush, following a sound that doesn't come from their ears, but from their bones. And you smile, because now you know. This trail, the one Clarence started, the one Thomas followed, the one Nora rediscovered and passed on through croaker and journals and whispered stories, it was never a line. It was a circle, a growing, ever-widening ring of faith and memory and grace. And now you're part of it, forever. So don't wait for the world to tell you when to begin. Don't wait for the laughter to stop. Take the step, follow the mule. And if you ever find yourself lost, truly lost, look to the hills, feel the wind, and listen. You just might hear the faint sound of hooves and realize the trail was under your feet all along. And when that moment comes, when you feel it deep down, not like a jolt, but like an old memory returning, you'll understand that the trail was never about where it led. It was about what it awakened. Because Clarence didn't just guide Thomas to fortune, he guided him to stillness, to presence, to a life lived by feel, not force. A life where every step had meaning even if no one else saw it. And maybe that's what we're all really searching for. Not riches, not glory, but meaning. The kind of meaning that comes when you realize you don't have to be perfect to matter. You don't have to be whole to lead. You don't have to have all the answers to carry someone forward. You just have to keep walking, like Clarence did and like Thomas did and like the girl in the orchard, the boy by the barn, the teacher with the torn-up book full of maps. All of them pulled forward by something older than instinct and stronger than fear. Hope, that quiet, defiant belief that what's lost can be found, that what's broken can be useful, that what's laughed at can change the world. And now that hope is yours to carry. So whether your trail leads through forests or farmland, across deserts or down alleys, remember this. Clarence walked it first, and wherever your feet take you, he's just a few hoofbeats ahead, waiting, watching, trusting you to carry the story forward. And now, with your next step, you do. And with that step, you take your place in the lineage, not of treasure hunters, not of historians, but of believers, of those rare, steady souls who know that the most important things in life are the ones nobody else notices: the mule with the crooked leg, the map with the faded ink, the truth buried beneath a century of dust and silence. You walk on, through fog, through doubt, through laughter from those who still don't understand. And when you reach that quiet place, be it a clearing, a porch, a forgotten grave, you'll feel it in your chest like the beat of something ancient and alive. You'll kneel, you'll listen, you'll remember, and you'll know without a shadow of a doubt that you were never alone. Clarence walked before you. Thomas cleared the way. And now it's your turn, not to find what they found, but to find what only you can, because there are still boxes waiting beneath the roots, still names waiting to be spoken aloud again, still pieces of this world, small, rusted, nearly lost, that only you will know how to carry back into the light. And when you do, someone will watch you, a stranger, a friend, a child. They'll see you walking with quiet purpose, stopping where others rush, kneeling where others step over. And they'll ask, "How did you know to look there?" And all you'll do is smile. Then maybe you'll say it, soft and sure and full of something deep as the oldest canyon, because the mule remembered. Then you'll rise and walk on, because the trail never ends, and neither does the story.